the sound. Not the judge's gavel, not the murmurs of the lawyers, not even the shuffle of papers in the crowded courtroom. It was the cough, a dry, hollow cough that seemed to rattle straight out of my father's bones. The kind of sound that made strangers turn their heads, that made you want to press a hand to your own chest in sympathy. That was the sound my father made as he stood before the court that morning. He tried to cover it, of course. He pressed his fist against his lips, lowered his head like a man clearing his throat. But I knew, God, I knew, he was sick, far sicker than he had ever let me believe. The room was silent in that way courtrooms often are, a silence that feels heavy, almost sacred, like everyone is waiting for a life to tip one way or the other. My father gripped the edge of the wooden table as if it were the only thing holding him up. His shoulders trembled beneath his worn suit jacket. And yet when the judge asked him to speak, he lifted his head, his voice steady, and he spoke not of himself, not of his pain, but of his family. Our home, he said, pausing to breathe, is not just a piece of land or a roof. It is where my son grew up. It is where my wife's picture still hangs by the staircase. It is the only place we have ever called ours. The words hung in the air, simple words, but I swear they weighed more than any legal document on that table. I looked at him, this man I had always seen as unbreakable. The man who worked double shifts, who fixed the leaky roof with his bare hands, who slipped cash into my college books so I'd think I had forgotten a 20. And there he was, standing in a courtroom, his body betraying him, his lungs failing him, still trying to hold the weight of all of us. And I realized something that nearly broke me. He had been carrying a secret, one he thought was better hidden, one he thought would protect me. When you grow up in America, you're taught to believe fathers are made of steel, that they are the ones who don't fall, who don't flinch, who don't let you see them bleed. And maybe that's why he hid it. The nights of pain he swallowed down with black coffee. The doctor's warnings stuffed in the back of a drawer. The chemotherapy appointments he canceled because work was more important. He hid it because that's what fathers think they're supposed to do. But as I watched him that morning, fingers shaking as he shuffled the papers in front of the judge, I no longer saw steel. I saw flesh. I saw fragility. I saw a man who had spent his life building a shield around me, and now that shield was cracking. The lawyer beside him whispered, "Sir, maybe you should sit down." But my father refused. He stood straighter, though every muscle in his frame trembled. And then, with a cough that tore through the room like thunder, he declared, "I will stand as long as my family still stands." Even the judge leaned back at those words. Even the opposing counsel glanced down, ashamed. Because sometimes the truth doesn't need legal language. Sometimes it doesn't even need evidence. Sometimes it's just one man, sick and breaking, but unwilling to let go of the people he loves. That was the moment, the exact moment, when my heart broke and swelled all at once. Broke, because I understood the truth. My father was dying. Swelled, because I realized another truth. Even in dying, he was still teaching me how to live. Outside, the autumn leaves were drifting past the courthouse windows. Inside, I sat frozen, a grown man feeling like a child again, watching the one person I could never imagine losing, stand on legs that could barely hold him, defending a family that had no idea how close we were to losing him. And that's how our story begins. Not with laughter at a dinner table, not with the simple comfort of a family Sunday, but with a cough in a courtroom and a son realizing too late that his father's silence had always been love in disguise. If you found out your father had hidden his illness, not to deceive you but to protect you, would you forgive him, or would you feel betrayed? Because that's the question I still ask myself. And maybe it's the question you'll ask too, as you hear the rest of this story. At home, my father had his rituals, not grand ones, not the kind you write down in a diary or celebrate on a calendar. They were quiet rituals stitched into the fabric of our days, the sound of the kettle whistling at 5 a.m., the scrape of his boots against the welcome mat as he left for work, the smell of cedar and oil when he returned from the factory, his jacket carrying the day back into our kitchen. To anyone else, it was routine. To me back then, it was the comfort of normal. Only later would I realize it was also camouflage. The truth of his illness was hidden in the cracks of those rituals. He would step into the bathroom after work and let the faucet run, longer than necessary, as if the rush of water could drown out the ragged breaths he fought to steady. He kept a small tin of mints in his pocket, not because he loved the taste, but because the sharp sting of peppermint masked the bitter residue of pills that melted too slowly on his tongue. And at dinner, when I pushed a plate of roasted chicken toward him, he'd smile and say he wasn't hungry, that he had grabbed a sandwich on the way home. But the truth was simpler, sadder. Chewing had become an effort. Every swallow a reminder of the battle he never confessed. Our house held its own secrets, too. The medicine bottles lined up behind the paint cans in the garage. The crumpled hospital bills folded into the pages of a repair manual. The faint scent of antiseptic clinging to the laundry basket, where he had tossed shirts stained with traces of blood he couldn't quite scrub away. I passed by these clues 100 times, blind, maybe because I didn't want to see, maybe because I was too wrapped up in the noise of my own life, school deadlines, part-time jobs, late-night friends, or maybe because he wanted it that way. He arranged his secrets like furniture in the house, close enough to be noticed, ordinary enough to be ignored. One evening I heard him in the shed. It was dark outside, the kind of early winter night when the sky folds into itself, and the air smells of smoke from neighbors' fireplaces. I had gone out to fetch a ladder. Through the thin wooden walls I heard the scrape of a chair, then a cough, low, violent, so different from the polite clears of the throat I knew. It lasted too long. It sounded like it tore something loose inside him. When I pushed open the door, he was hunched over the workbench, a rag pressed to his lips. He looked up, startled, his face pale in the dim light bulb swinging overhead. There was a smear of red on the rag. For a moment, our eyes locked. A father caught, a son too young to name the truth he was seeing. And then, like he always did, he found a story. "Splinter," he muttered, lifting his hand as though the blood belonged to his palm, not his lungs. "Clumsy old man. Don't tell your mother." I nodded, because what else do you do when the person you trust most tells you not to worry? The next morning, he was up before the sun again, boots laced, thermos of coffee in hand, humming an old country tune as if nothing had happened. That was his curtain, not velvet, not grand, but ordinary life arranged so neatly it disguised the shadows behind it. Looking back now, I wonder how many people live behind such curtains. How many fathers go to work with aching bones, mothers smile through migraines, brothers swallow secrets with aspirin, all because they think silence is protection. I wonder how many families mistake those silences for strength. On Sundays we sat together in the living room. The football game on, the scent of popcorn filling the air. My father leaned back in his recliner, eyes half closed, as if the simple comfort of the game was enough. But sometimes, if you looked closely, you could see his fingers trembling against the armrest. You could see the way he pressed 2 fingers against his ribs, as though measuring the time left in his own body. And still, if I asked, he would only smile and say, "Don't worry about me, kid, I'm fine." The curtain held, and I, a son too trusting, let it. When I was a boy, my father's hands were the first clocks I ever knew. They woke me before the alarm. They shook me gently when the school bus pulled up outside. They clapped against each other when my team won its first Little League game. Big, rough hands, cracked at the knuckles, scarred in lines that told stories of machines and ladders and winters too cold for gloves. Those hands built my childhood, and I never stopped to wonder what it cost him. He worked in a factory on the edge of town, the kind of place you could smell before you saw, oil and iron in the air, a low hum of machines drifting out of the wide, tin doors. I remember visiting once, holding Mom's hand as we brought him lunch. The clang of metal echoed in my chest like a drum. The floor vibrated beneath my sneakers. Men shouted over the roar. And in the middle of it all there was my father, a blur of motion, lifting, bending, welding sparks flying around him like angry fireflies. His shirt clung to his back with sweat, his hair damp under the heavy helmet. Yet when he saw us, he grinned wide, easy, like none of it touched him at all. He handed me a wrench heavy in my small palms. "Feel that?" he said. "That's weight. Remember, every weight you carry for someone you love." I nodded. I didn't really understand, but I never forgot. At home he was no less relentless. Our roof leaked one spring. I woke to the sound of rain dripping into a bucket, and there he was balancing on the shingles at dawn, his shadow bent against the pink horizon. One Christmas money was tight. The tree looked bare. Then, as if by magic, presents appeared, not flashy, not store-bought, but toys he had carved in the shed, their edges still smelling of pine and varnish. When my sneakers tore at the seams, he patched them with needle and thread. When the heater sputtered out one January, he stayed up all night feeding logs to the fireplace, his eyes red, his body swaying with fatigue, but his voice steady when he told me, "Go back to sleep, you'll be warm." His sacrifices weren't just measured in money or sweat. They were measured in absence. The empty chair at school plays, the vacant spot at the dinner table when a shift ran long, the muffled clink of dishes Mom set aside, saving him a plate he often never touched. As a boy, I sometimes felt the sting of it. I wanted him there. I wanted him cheering from the bleachers, waiting in the car line after practice. But when I saw the fatigue etched into his face as he stumbled through the door, when I smelled the smoke of his work still clinging to his jacket, I bit my tongue, because even in his absence, I knew he was present in the only way he could be, by keeping everything else from collapsing. There is one night I cannot forget. I must have been 12. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet when even the pipes seemed to hush. I crept into the kitchen for water. There he was, sitting in the dark at the table. No lights on, just the glow of the street lamp leaking through the blinds. His head was bowed, his fingers pressed hard into his temples. On the table lay a stack of bills, yellow envelopes and pink slips scattered like fallen leaves. I froze, unsure if I was supposed to see. He didn't notice me at first. When he finally did, he straightened, slid the bills into a drawer, and forced a smile. Beside the drawer, I noticed a small tape recorder, the kind with buttons worn smooth from use, another of his quiet habits, saving not only papers but voices, as if proof itself needed to be preserved. "Couldn't sleep either?" he asked, his voice soft, raspy. I nodded. He poured me a glass of milk, sat with me until my eyes drooped. And only when I climbed the stairs did I realize his own glass was empty. I grew up believing sacrifice was silent, that it came without applause, without thanks, that it lived in late nights and aching backs, in patched roofs and second-hand shoes, in the way my father made sure I never noticed the cracks he carried. He gave his body to labor, his mind to worry, his heart to hope, and he asked for nothing, not praise, not recognition, not even rest, just the simple reassurance that we were okay, that the family he fought for every day was still standing. It is only now, as I replay those years, that I understand the magnitude of what he carried. Every dollar saved, every hour stolen from his own sleep, every dream he folded neatly and tucked away so mine could unfold. They were all pieces of him, pieces he gave without ever letting me see the cost. And I, his son, mistook those sacrifices for ordinary life. In the early mornings when the world was still, my father often stood by the living room window. The house was quiet then. The radiator ticked softly as heat crawled through the pipes. A faint draft slipped under the door, carrying the smell of damp earth and last night's rain. He would sip his coffee, the steam fogging the glass, and look out at the street. But what he was really seeing, what filled his gaze, was not outside at all. It was us. This family he had built and guarded, plank by plank, year by year. He saw my sneakers kicked off by the door, the scuffed leather, the laces knotted carelessly. To me they were just shoes, forgotten in haste. To him they were proof his boy was running, moving forward, not standing still. He saw the photographs lining the hallway. My awkward school pictures, hair too long, smile too crooked. His wife's portrait, framed in walnut, catching the morning light. Sometimes he paused there, his fingertips grazing the edge of the frame, as if touch could preserve what time kept pulling away. And in the kitchen he saw the stack of bills tucked neatly on the counter, each envelope a reminder of what was owed, what was due. But instead of dread, he carried them like markers of survival, evidence that the lights were still on, the roof still overhead, the pantry still holding food. Through his eyes, family was never abstract. It was tactile, almost sacred, found in the smallest details. The smell of detergent on folded laundry, the squeak of the back door hinge he kept meaning to oil, the laughter of his son drifting down the hallway late at night, mixed with the muffled bass of a song played too loud through cheap headphones. He took these fragments, stitched them together, and called them home. But behind his steady gaze, there was another layer. Some mornings, when the light hit just right, his reflection in the window startled him, the pallor in his cheeks, the way his collarbone pressed too sharply against his shirt, the tremor in his hand as he raised the cup. He told no one. Instead, he swallowed the ache, turned from the glass, and walked back into the kitchen as though nothing had cracked inside him, because in his eyes family deserved continuity, and continuity required silence. He watched me grow in snapshots. The first time I mowed the lawn, pushing the stubborn machine across uneven grass while he stood by, arms crossed, hiding a smile. The first time I drove away alone, taillights glowing red as dusk swallowed the street. He stayed on the porch long after the car disappeared, listening to the fading hum of the engine, wondering how many more departures he would live to see. The first time he heard me raise my voice at him, sharp, impatient, he didn't answer back. He just lowered his eyes, and in the privacy of his own heart forgave me instantly, because fathers forgive long before sons know they've erred. At night, when the house finally exhaled into sleep, he sometimes sat alone in the recliner. The TV flickered with half-watched shows. The remote rested heavy in his lap. He wasn't watching the screen. He was watching shadows, imagining futures. Would he see me marry? Would he hold a grandchild? Or would those milestones arrive in a world that no longer held him? The questions pressed into his chest like invisible weights, but he bore them silently. He reminded himself that sacrifice was not about witnessing the harvest. It was about planting seeds even if someone else would see them bloom. Family, through his eyes, was not perfect. It was fragile, noisy, often ungrateful. But it was also the only thing that gave meaning to his fight. Every ache in his body, every long shift, every secret swallowed, they all pointed back to the same truth. Love is not loud. It is quiet. It is steady. It is the act of standing guard at a window before dawn, counting not the hours left, but the blessings already in hand. The first sign came in the smallest way. One afternoon I slipped into the hallway to grab my backpack. The air smelled faintly of dust and coffee grounds, the ordinary scent of our house, but mingled with it was something sharper, sterile, a note of alcohol wipes, the kind you only find in hospitals. I followed it without thinking, past the laundry room into the garage. On the workbench sat a white paper bag folded at the top, the kind of pharmacy hands over. It bore my father's name. Inside, amber bottles clinked softly against each other, their labels crowded with long foreign words I couldn't pronounce. I froze, my pulse quickening. Dad had never taken more than aspirin in his life. Why would he need so many? I told myself it was nothing. Vitamins, maybe. Supplements for energy. A man who worked as hard as he did was entitled to a little help. But then came the nights. From my room I would hear the floorboards creak under slow, uneven steps, the muted sound of a chair scraping across the kitchen tile. And then coughing, not the clearing of a throat, not a passing tickle, but a deep, wrenching sound, as though his body were folding in on itself. It would go on, long enough that I sometimes pressed my pillow over my ears, not because I didn't care, but because I was afraid of what I might learn if I kept listening. Next sign came at dinner. We sat at the table, the overhead light buzzing faintly above us. Mom's photograph still watched from the wall, her smile faded but steady. I speared a piece of meatloaf, waiting for him to do the same, but he only pushed his food around, his fork scraping gently against the plate. His hand shook. When he finally did lift a bite, he chewed slowly, deliberately, as if every swallow cost him something. "You're not hungry?" I asked, looked up quickly, too quickly. "I had something earlier," he said, forcing a grin, the same line he always used. I wanted to believe him, but the bite of food sat untouched, and his shoulders sagged as though carrying a weight no one else could see. One Saturday I borrowed his truck to run errands. The glove compartment was stiff, the latch catching as I tugged it open. Out spilled a folder, papers scattering across the passenger seat. I gathered them in a hurry. Receipts, old insurance forms. And then, folded carefully between them, a letterhead stamped with the name of the hospital. My eyes scanned the first line before I could stop myself. Oncology department. The words blurred, my throat tightening. I shoved the papers back, slammed the compartment shut. My hands trembled on the steering wheel. The road ahead swam in front of me. I told myself again it was nothing. A mistake. Someone else's paperwork. Anything but the truth that hovered like smoke in my chest. Still, denial only carries you so far. One evening, I walked into the living room to find him asleep in the recliner. The television flickered with a game show, the sound turned low. His head was tilted back, mouth slightly open. What caught me wasn't the sleep itself, but the way his skin looked under the lamplight. Sallow, drawn, His breath came in shallow pulls, his chest rising unevenly as though each inhale had to fight its way through. And on the side table, half hidden beneath a newspaper, was a single bottle from the pharmacy bag, the cap unscrewed. The pills inside rattled softly when I touched it, like tiny bones in a hollow jar. I stood there, staring at him. Part of me wanted to wake him, demand answers. Another part wanted to let him sleep, to preserve the fragile illusion that everything was still intact. But illusions don't last, not when the signs begin to multiply. The smell of antiseptic clinging faintly to his jacket, sudden winces he tried to mask when he bent too quickly. The way he lingered at the stairwell, catching his breath as if the climb were a mountain. They piled up one by one, until even the blindest sun could not pretend anymore. And yet when his eyes opened and met mine across the room, he smiled, as if none of it mattered, as if his body weren't betraying him piece by piece, as if the act of holding us together was worth more than his own survival. I smiled back, but inside something cracked, because the first signs had already found me, and no curtain in the world could hide them anymore. It happened on a Tuesday night. The house smelled of tomato sauce and garlic bread, my attempt at dinner. I heard him come in, the door groaning on its hinges, the soft shuffle of his boots against the mat. When he stepped into the kitchen, he looked worn thin, as if the day had wrung him out. "Smells good," he said, forcing brightness into his voice. He reached for a plate, but I caught the tremor in his hand. Fork clattered lightly against the ceramic. I watched him closely as he sat down. His face was pale beneath the yellow glow of the overhead light, a sheen of sweat glistening at his hairline, though the room wasn't warm. For too long I had swallowed the questions, but that night they pressed at my chest until they spilled out. "Dad, are you sick?" The fork froze halfway to his mouth. His eyes flicked up to mine, sharp, startled, then softened just as quickly. He chuckled, but it was thin, unconvincing. "Me? No, just getting old, that's all." I didn't look away. Old age doesn't make you cough blood into a rag. His smile faltered. The silence between us thickened, filled only by the hum of the refrigerator. Finally, he set the fork down, the metal ringing faintly against the plate. "You've been snooping," he said gently, not accusing, almost tender. His tone carried more weariness than anger. "I found the pills," I admitted, "and the papers from the hospital." He sighed then, a long, heavy sound that seemed to deflate him. His shoulders curved inward, and for a moment he looked smaller, like the weight he carried had finally pressed him down. "Those aren't for you to worry about," he murmured. "How can I not worry?" My voice cracked, louder than I intended. "You're hiding something that's eating you alive, and you think I won't notice." His eyes glistened, but he didn't break. He reached across the table, his hand covering mine. The skin warm but thin, veins raised like blue rivers beneath the surface. "Son," he said softly, "every family has burdens. Mine is to carry this one so you don't have to." I pulled my hand back, frustrated. "That's not how it works. You don't get to decide what I can handle." But he only shook his head, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "You're young, you have a life to build. You shouldn't spend it watching over an old man with bad lungs." "Stop saying that," I snapped. The chair legs scraped against the floor as I stood. "You're not just an old man, you're my father, and I have a right to know what's happening to you." The air between us burned with things unsaid. He leaned back, coughing suddenly, his whole body shaking with the effort. I instinctively reached for him, but he waved me off, grabbing a napkin, covering his mouth until the fit subsided. When he finally looked up, the napkin was balled tightly in his fist. He kept it hidden, but I had already seen the faint, rust-colored stain seeping through the fabric. "See," I whispered, "you can't keep pretending." His voice, when it came, was low, steady, almost rehearsed. "It's nothing fatal, just something the doctors are keeping an eye on." I wanted to believe him. Part of me clung to the lie like a child clutching a nightlight. But another part knew his words were a shield, and the shield was cracking. "Promise me," I said, softer now, the anger draining into fear. "Promise me you'll tell me the truth, no more hiding." He reached again, this time touching my shoulder. His eyes were tired but kind. "I promise to tell you what you need to know when the time comes." It wasn't enough. We both knew it. But the conversation ended there, suspended in a fragile truce neither of us wanted to break. Later that night I passed by the kitchen again. The light was off, but I heard the faint rustle of paper. I peeked around the corner. There he was, bent over the table, sorting through envelopes, pill bottles lined up like soldiers beside him. He paused once, pressing his hand to his chest, closing his eyes as if steadying himself. The moonlight spilled through the window, catching the lines on his face, the wear etched deep in his skin. I could have walked in. I could have asked again. But I stayed in the shadows, silent, watching a man fight a battle alone, even as he swore to me it didn't exist. The hospital smelled of antiseptic and overcooked coffee. That sharp, sterile scent clung to the walls, to the plastic chairs lined up in neat rows, to my very clothes as I sat waiting. I hadn't planned on being there. I was only supposed to pick up paperwork. Dad had insisted he could handle appointments on his own, but that morning he'd been too unsteady to drive. So I dropped him off, told him I'd wait in the lobby, flipping through a magazine I wasn't really reading. The minutes stretched. Voices echoed faintly through the corridor, heels clicking against linoleum, the low murmur of nurses. Every so often a cart rattled past, the metallic clink of instruments like a distant warning bell. I stood to stretch, pacing toward the water fountain. That's when I heard it. Two doctors, their voices hushed but clear enough in the narrow hallway. One carried a clipboard pressed tight to his chest. The other leaned closer, his tone low, deliberate. "Stage 4, he said. His lungs are failing faster than we projected. He should have told his family months ago." The word struck me like a blow. Stage 4, not stage 1, not something manageable. The end stage. I froze, gripping the fountain's edge until the metal chilled my palms. They walked past without noticing me. I caught fragments as they moved. Palliative options, time frame, difficult decisions. Each word landed heavy, as if the floor beneath me was sinking. I turned back toward the waiting area. Dad's jacket was draped over a chair, frayed at the cuffs, smelling faintly of tobacco smoke from years gone by. He wasn't back yet. My knees went weak. I sat down, staring at that jacket, seeing it in a new, unbearable light. It was no longer just a jacket. It was the shell of a man who had carried me, sheltered me, and was now carrying a secret bigger than either of us. When he finally emerged, he looked tired but composed, as though he'd been rehearsing calm. He spotted me and forced a smile, adjusting the collar of his shirt. "Didn't expect you to wait," he said, his voice steady, too steady. "Let's get out of here. These places will make you sick even if you're healthy." I tried to answer, but the words stuck in my throat. All I could do was watch him, his shoulders squared, his steps measured. A performance meant to hide the truth I already knew. In the car, the silence was unbearable. The engine hummed beneath us, the heater blowing warm air that smelled faintly of dust. Outside, the sky was a dull winter gray, the trees bare and skeletal along the roadside. I gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles blanched. Finally, I whispered, "Why didn't you tell me?" His head turned sharply. "What do you mean?" "Stage 4, I said, the words tasting like ash. "I heard them, the doctors. They said you should have told your family months ago." The silence that followed was different this time. Not heavy, not awkward. It was devastating. His lips parted, but no sound came. For the first time, I saw him at a loss, stripped of the easy lies, the practiced reassurances. The mask slipped, and beneath it was raw exhaustion. He looked out the window, his breath fogging the glass. When he finally spoke, his voice was so soft I had to strain to hear. "I didn't want you to carry it. I thought, if I could hold it long enough, maybe you'd never have to." I slammed my palm against the steering wheel. The horn blared, startling us both. "Never have to, Dad, I'm your son. You don't get to decide that for me." He flinched at the anger in my voice, but he didn't argue. Instead, he reached across the console, his hand trembling as it landed on mine. His skin was cool, papery. "You were supposed to live free," he whispered. "Not chained to my illness, not chained to watching me fade." My eyes burned. The road blurred. I pulled the car to the side, the tires crunching against gravel. For a long moment we just sat there. The heater clicked softly, the faint hiss of air filling the silence. Finally, I broke. "Stage 4, I repeated, barely audible. "How much time do you have?" He didn't answer right away. His hand slipped away, resting in his lap. His gaze stayed fixed on the barren trees outside, their branches tangled against the gray sky. "Enough," he said at last. "Enough to keep protecting you until I can't." The words shattered something inside me, because I knew enough could mean weeks, it could mean days, and I wasn't ready. I would never be ready. The night after the hospital, I couldn't sleep. The house was silent, but my chest roared with a storm I couldn't contain. Every creak of the floorboards, every faint hum of the refrigerator felt amplified. like the house itself was mocking the silence my father had forced on us for months. I sat at the edge of my bed, fists clenched, staring at the shadows on the wall. The words from the doctors, stage 4, kept repeating in my mind, each echo sharper than the last. And beneath it all was the same question, burning hotter with every breath. How could he hide this from me? By morning, the anger had built into something unbearable. He was in the kitchen, buttering toast with his usual calm, as though he hadn't just walked out of a building where his death sentence had been spoken aloud. The smell of burnt bread filled the air. The scrape of the knife against the crust grated on my nerves. I slammed a cabinet door shut harder than I intended. The sound cracked through the room. He looked up, startled. "You all right?" That simple question broke the dam. "All right?" I snapped. "You're dying, Dad, and you've been lying to me for months. Do I look all right to you?" His hand froze midair, crumbs scattered across the counter. The calm mask he always wore flickered, but he tried to recover. "I wasn't lying," he said quietly. "I was protecting you, protecting me." My voice rose, sharp and ragged. "You call this protection, letting me find out from strangers in a hallway. Do you know what it felt like standing there hearing those words about my own father like I was nothing more than an outsider?" He opened his mouth, but I didn't let him answer. The anger poured out, unstoppable. "You should have trusted me. You should have given me the chance to stand beside you instead of pushing me away. Do you think I'm too weak, too childish? I'm your son, not some fragile thing you have to shelter." My voice cracked, the words dissolving into something rower, almost a plea. "You've been carrying this alone, and now it's too late. You robbed me of the time we could have had, real time, honest time." He finally set the knife down, his hand trembling against the counter. When he turned toward me, I saw the exhaustion etched deep into his face. "You think it was easy for me?" he asked softly. "Every day I looked at you and wanted to tell you. But then I'd see your future in your eyes, the plans, the freedom, the life I wanted for you. How could I take that away with my sickness?" The words hit me, but they only stoked the fire. "Do you even hear yourself? You didn't protect me, Dad. You isolated me. You shut me out of your life while your body was falling apart. Do you know how selfish that feels?" The word hung between us, selfish, ugly, sharp. I regretted it the moment it left my lips, but I couldn't take it back. His eyes dimmed, but he didn't argue. That quiet acceptance only made my fury burn hotter. "Why won't you fight for yourself?" I demanded. "You fight for bills, for the house, for everyone else. Why not fight for your own life? For me?" He lowered his gaze, his chest rising slowly, painfully. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely more than a whisper. "I am fighting, just not in the way you want me to." Something inside me cracked. The anger that had been roaring turned jagged, mixed with grief. My throat burned. My hands shook at my sides. I wanted to punch something, to shatter the kitchen windows, to make a sound loud enough to drown out the truth pressing down on me. Instead, I paced, my steps heavy against the tile. The air smelled of burnt toast, sharp and bitter, the scent clinging to everything like an accusation. "You don't get it," I said, my voice breaking. "You don't get to decide this for me. You don't get to choose silence and call it love." He didn't move. He just stood there, shoulders hunched, as if my fury were another weight he decided to bear in silence. I slammed my fist against the table. The plates rattled, a glass tipped and rolled, the sound piercing the quiet like shrapnel. My breath came fast, uneven. My eyes burned hot, but no tears fell, only anger, thick and choking. I looked at him, my father, this man I'd trusted all my life, and for the first time I didn't see strength. I saw a stranger who had chosen lies over trust, silence over love, and in that moment I hated him for it. Not forever, not deep down, but in that raw, unfiltered instant. I hated him because the truth had come too late, and anger was easier to bear than the grief waiting underneath. The letter came in a plain white envelope, slipped through the mail slot on a damp morning. I heard it fall against the hardwood, a sharp slap that startled me from the kitchen. When I bent down to pick it up, I saw the return address, a law office across town. The black ink bled slightly on the paper where the rain had touched it, but the words were still clear, too clear. It was a summons, a dispute over the deed to our home. I carried it to him, my hands trembling. He sat at the table, his tea steaming in front of him, the faint clink of his spoon stirring sugar. When I laid the envelope down, he didn't touch it right away. His eyes lingered on the paper as though he already knew its weight. Finally, he slid it open, reading each line carefully. I watched his face tighten, his jaw clench, but his voice remained calm. "They're trying to take the house," he said quietly. "As if we haven't paid every bill, fought for every brick." Anger flared in me, sharp and instant. "Then let me handle it. You shouldn't be the one." He raised a hand, silencing me. His fingers trembled slightly, but his eyes were steady. "This is my fight," he said. "This family doesn't lose its ground while I can still stand." The weeks that followed were a blur of meetings, papers, appointments. I drove him to the lawyer's office, helped him up narrow staircases when his breath came short, watched him adjust his tie in the bathroom mirror, his reflection pale beneath the fluorescent lights. But once he stepped into that office, he was no longer the man coughing in the night. He was a wall, steady, unyielding, sharp with details I never knew he carried. He remembered every payment, every receipt folded away in boxes, every sacrifice etched into the very foundation of our house. One afternoon, I watched him spread papers across the lawyer's desk. The air smelled faintly of ink and stale coffee. Sunlight slanted through half-closed blinds, striping the documents in pale gold. His hand moved slowly, but his voice was firm. "This is the record of every mortgage payment. This is proof of taxes filed on time every year. This house was bought with sweat, with long nights and broken bones. And no one will take it from my family." I felt my throat tighten. He wasn't just defending walls and windows. He was defending every moment we had lived inside them. Birthdays in the living room, Mom's laughter drifting from the kitchen, my sneakers thumping down the stairs for school. But even as he spoke with fire, his body betrayed him. I saw the way he leaned heavily on the desk, the shallow rise of his chest, the tremor that rippled through his hands when he tried to shuffle the papers. The lawyer glanced at me once, concerned, but Dad ignored it. He pressed on, his voice steady even as sweat dampened his collar. I wanted to shout, to tell him to sit down, to rest, but part of me knew this was the only way he knew how to live, fighting, protecting, carrying burdens no one asked him to carry. The night before the first court date, I found him in the living room. He sat in his chair, not watching television, not reading, just sitting, staring at the walls as though committing them to memory. The lamp cast a warm glow across the room, catching the silver in his hair, the deep lines carved into his face. In his lap lay a thin folder of papers, his hand resting gently on top of it. When I asked if he was ready, he didn't answer right away. Finally, he looked up, his eyes soft but resolute. "This house, it's more than wood and nails," he said. "It's proof that I kept my promise, to your mother, to you, that no matter how hard life hit, we stood. And tomorrow I'll stand again, no matter the cost." His words cut through me, not because of their strength, but because of the quiet finality in them. I wanted to argue, to tell him his life mattered more than any piece of land. But as I looked at him, his body frail, his spirit unbroken, I understood this was the last gift he could give. Not money, not time, but protection. The kind of protection that had defined every moment of his life. And so, the next morning, we walked into the courthouse together. The marble floors echoed beneath our steps. The air smelled faintly of old paper and polished wood. He straightened his back, adjusted his tie, and for a fleeting second, I saw not the sick man I had come to fear losing, but the father I had always known, unyielding, determined, carrying us all even as his body broke beneath the weight. The courthouse was colder than I expected. The air smelled faintly of polished wood and paper, with an undertone of something metallic, like old radiators that hadn't been bled properly in years. Our footsteps echoed against the marble floor as we walked down the corridor, each step heavier than the last. When we entered the courtroom, I felt it immediately. A weight, a pressure that wasn't just from the high ceilings or the rows of watchful faces. It was the silence, the kind of silence that holds its breath, waiting for something to crack. My father walked slowly to our table, his hand brushing against the edge of the chair for balance. He wore his best suit, pressed the night before, but the fabric hung loose against his thinning frame. Still, he straightened, lifting his chin as though daring anyone to notice the weakness underneath. The judge entered, the gavel struck once, and the room stirred. Papers rustled, chairs shifted, the low murmur of voices cut off in an instant. Opposite us sat the other party, sharp suits, polished shoes, eyes cold and certain. They looked at my father the way wolves look at an aging stag. Calm, patient, convinced he couldn't hold out long. When his name was called to testify, he rose. For a heartbeat, I thought he might not make it. His knees locked, his hand gripped the table so tightly his knuckles blanched. Then, with a breath that seemed to tear through his chest, he stepped forward. The wooden floor creaked under his weight. Every eye followed him as he approached the witness stand. I could hear my own pulse pounding in my ears. The oath was read. His voice rasped as he repeated the words. And then he began. He spoke not like a man defending property, but like a man defending memory. He told them of the first payment he scraped together, the late nights and the double shifts, the way he counted coins on the kitchen table until they added up to just enough. He described fixing the roof after storms, laying tiles with his own hands, watching his son run barefoot through the halls. His voice was rough, but it carried. Every word was laced with years of sacrifice. But then, a cough. It came sudden, violent, racking through his chest. The sound split the silence, raw and jagged. He pressed a handkerchief to his lips, shoulders shaking. For a moment I thought he might collapse right there on the stand. Gasps rippled through the benches. The judge leaned forward, concerned. Even the opposing counsel glanced at one another uneasily. He waved them off, struggling for breath. "I'm fine," he croaked, his hand trembling as he folded the handkerchief. Then, with a steadiness that seemed impossible, he continued. Every sentence cost him. I could see it, the sweat beading at his temples, the way he gripped the edge of the stand for support. But he pressed on, laying out the evidence, document after document. Receipts, tax records, notarized copies. His memory was exact, precise, unshakable. Even as his body betrayed him, his mind remained razor sharp. At one point, the lawyer on the other side objected, his voice cutting through the air with practiced arrogance. But my father met his gaze, and in that moment there was no sickness, no frailty, only defiance. A man who had given everything and refused to be dismissed. The tension in the room thickened with every word. I could hear the scratch of pens, the shuffle of papers, the shallow breaths of strangers leaning forward, drawn into a story that was no longer just about legal ownership, but about dignity, about the right to stand and be heard. I sat on the edge of my seat, torn between pride and fear. Every time he paused, my stomach knotted, afraid the pause might stretch too long, afraid he might not recover this time. But he did. Again and again he did. Finally, he placed the last paper down, his hand trembling as it slid across the wood. He looked up at the judge, his eyes clear despite the exhaustion clouding his face. "This house," he said, his voice breaking but firm, "is more than property. It is the sum of a life's labor. It is the place where my family has lived, and the place I intend for them to remain. I may be weak in body, but I will not let anyone take that away." The words hung in the air, heavy, unshakable, and for the first time since we walked in, I saw doubt flicker in the eyes of those who thought they could defeat him. The room felt close, stifling, though the air vents whispered overhead. I could hear the shuffle of papers, the tap of pens against notepads, the faint squeak of a shoe against polished floor. Everything ordinary, yet charged, as if the air itself was waiting for the next blow. My father stood at the witness stand, his body unsteady but his gaze unwavering. The opposition lawyer leaned back in his chair, lips curled in a practiced smirk, as if confident the tide was already turning his way. That was when my father reached for the worn leather briefcase at his feet. It was old, older than me. The handle cracked, the brass clasps dulled from decades of use. He had carried that briefcase to job interviews, to union meetings, to the bank when he signed the mortgage papers. Now his fingers, shaking, slow, worked the clasps open. A hush fell over the courtroom. The judge leaned forward. Even the clerk's hand, mid-note, paused above the paper. My father pulled out a folder thick with documents, its edges curled from years of storage, and laid it gently on the stand. "This," he said, his voice rasping, "is the record of every dollar I've paid for that house. Not just the receipts you've already seen, but the contracts, the agreements, the proof of the hours I traded for bricks and boards." The opposing lawyer scoffed, but my father raised a hand, silencing him without a word. From the folder he drew out one paper in particular. The paper was yellowed, the ink faded but legible. It bore signatures, not only his but also the man who had first sold him the property. "This," he continued, "was the original agreement, signed, witnessed, and notarized. It proves ownership beyond any doubt." The lawyer across the aisle shifted in his seat. I saw his composure falter just slightly, the faintest flicker of unease across his face. My father wasn't finished. He pulled out another envelope sealed and handed it to the judge. Inside lay photographs, time-stamped images of repairs, renovations, tax receipts with matching dates, each piece layered upon the next, a wall no one could break through. And then finally the smallest object of all, a cassette tape. The bailiff brought over a player, its plastic body scratched and dented, the kind of relic you'd find in a forgotten drawer. My father's hand trembled as he set the tape inside. A click, a low hum, then the static crackle of an old recording. At first, nothing. Then a voice, clear, sharp, unmistakable, the previous owner of the house. This property is transferred in full without condition. Payment complete. Ownership belongs to, he said my father's name, spelled it out, signed it in words for the record. The sound hung in the air like thunder. For a long moment no one moved. The judge's brows lifted. A few people in the benches whispered, the shuffle of their clothes loud in the stunned quiet. The opposing lawyer stood, flustered, objecting too quickly, too loudly, but the judge raised a hand, silencing him. "Sit down," she said firmly. "We will consider this evidence." The lawyer's face burned red as he sank back into his chair. I looked at my father. He stood straighter now, not because the sickness had loosened its grip, but because the truth had given him strength no medicine could. His chest rose with effort, but his eyes, they were alive, bright, fierce. He had pulled his last card, not a trick, not a gamble, but the truth, carried faithfully for decades in an old briefcase. When the tape clicked off, the silence that followed was heavy, reverent. You could hear every small sound, the creak of a bench as someone shifted, the faint rustle of a sleeve, the slow, deliberate breath of the judge as she leaned back in her chair. My father closed the folder, his hand steady now. He looked across the room at the men who had tried to strip him bare. And though his body swayed slightly, his voice carried with the clarity of a bell. "You cannot erase a lifetime," he said. "You cannot take from a man what he has already given his blood to earn." The room remained silent, as if even the walls themselves were listening. The tape clicked off, and the silence that followed was unbearable. It was the kind of silence that doesn't just fill a room, it seeps into your bones, demanding you feel every ounce of it. I looked at my father. He was still standing at the witness stand, his hand resting on the folder of evidence. His chest rose and fell in shallow pulls, his lips pale, the tendons in his neck straining with every breath. The strength in his words still lingered in the air. But his body, God, his body looked as though it had already given more than it had left to give. The judge leaned back, expression unreadable, scribbling a note. The opposing lawyer stared at the table, defeated for now, but I couldn't focus on any of it. All I saw was him, his shoulders trembling under the weight of his own lungs, the faint sheen of sweat darkening his collar, his fingers curling against the wood as if the stand were the only thing keeping him upright. And in that instant, something inside me broke. I pushed back my chair. The sound echoed through the courtroom, startling everyone. Before anyone could stop me, I was moving, across the aisle, past the rows of eyes that followed, past the clerk's startled gasp. My shoes struck the polished floor in sharp, hurried beats, a rhythm that matched the pounding of my chest. When I reached him, I didn't speak. I just wrapped my arms around him, gripping him as though my embrace could hold together everything the sickness was tearing apart. The smell of him hit me, not cologne, not soap, but the faint, earthy scent of sweat and paper and years of labor. It was the smell of home, the smell of safety. I pressed my face into his shoulder, and the tears came, violent, unrestrained, burning down my cheeks, soaking into the fabric of his suit. "I don't care about the house," I choked. "I don't care about the papers, or the proof, or the court. I just want you. I just need you." The room was silent again, but not the silence of formality. It was the silence of witnesses watching something raw, something no gavel or statute could contain. I felt his hand rise slowly, hesitant at first, then firm, settling against the back of my head. His palm was warm, his fingers trembling. "Son," he whispered, his voice rasping, "I'm still here. As long as I can be, I'm here." The words shattered me further, because they weren't a promise of forever. They were a promise of now, and now was all he had left to give. I clung tighter. His body felt smaller in my arms than I remembered, his frame fragile, yet still radiating that same unshakable steadiness he had always carried. Around us I sensed movement, the judge's gaze softening, the bailiff shifting uncomfortably, strangers in the benches lowering their eyes, as if to grant us a moment of privacy within the most public of places. He coughed suddenly, the sound muffled against my shoulder. I pulled back in alarm, but he only shook his head, forcing the faintest smile through the strain. "Don't cry for me," he said softly. "Cry when you must, but not because you think I'm defeated, not while I'm still standing." His words, fragile yet fierce, cut deeper than any verdict ever could. I wiped at my face, but the tears kept coming, my voice breaking in a way it hadn't since I was a child. "You don't have to keep proving yourself," I said. "You don't have to keep carrying everything alone. Let me carry you. Please, Dad, let me carry you." For a moment his eyes closed. When they opened again, there was something there, a flicker not of surrender but of recognition, a father seeing, maybe for the first time, that his son was ready to share the weight. We stood like that, locked in an embrace that was both desperate and defiant. The hum of the fluorescent lights buzzed above us. The faint scratching of a pen resumed at the clerk's desk. But the rest of the world seemed distant, muted. In that courtroom, amid the dust of old books and the weight of law, there was only us. A father who had given everything and a son who finally understood the price. And for the first time, I let the grief wash through me fully, not hidden, not restrained, but out in the open, where everyone could see, where he could feel it too. The judge's gavel struck once, sharp as a thunderclap. The sound cut through the room, through my pulse, through the breath I didn't know I was holding. "All rise," the bailiff called, his voice echoing against the paneled walls. Everyone stood. Wood scraped under hurried feet, clothes rustled, a collective hush fell over us like a heavy cloak. My father straightened beside me, his hand brushing the edge of the table for balance. His breathing was ragged, shallow, but his eyes were steady, locked on the bench where justice now waited. The judge adjusted her glasses, her expression unreadable. She looked down at the stack of evidence, the photographs, the receipts, the cassette tape now labeled and sealed. Her pen tapped once against the paper in front of her, a tiny, rhythmic sound that made my stomach twist tighter with each beat. For a moment, the only sound in the room was the low hum of the ceiling fan and the faint cough from the back row. Every second stretched, taut as wire. Then the judge spoke. "This court has reviewed the testimony, the documentation, and the recorded statement presented as evidence." Her voice was measured, but it filled the room, each word deliberate. She glanced toward the opposing counsel, who sat stiff, lips pressed into a thin line, then back to my father. "It is the decision of this court," she continued, "that ownership of the property in question remains with the defendant. All claims against him are dismissed." The words hung in the air, heavy, decisive, final. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then the room seemed to exhale at once, whispers rippling through the benches, papers shuffling, shoes shifting against the floor. I felt my chest crack open with relief. A flood of breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding tore out of me, shaky and uneven. Beside me, my father closed his eyes briefly, as if offering a silent prayer. When he opened them again, he didn't smile, he didn't gloat. He simply nodded once, a quiet acknowledgement that the fight was over. The opposing lawyer rose, face flushed, papers clutched in his hands. He muttered something about appeals, about procedure, but no one was listening. The tide had turned, and he knew it. Even the judge's gaze dismissed him, a subtle flick of her hand. "This matter is settled," she said firmly. "Court is adjourned." The gavel struck again, the final note in a symphony of tension. I turned to my father, words caught in my throat, but before I could speak, he reached for my arm. His grip was weak, yet the warmth of it shot straight into my chest. "We did it," I whispered, my voice cracking. "No," he murmured, his breath shallow but sure. "You did, just by standing with me." His eyes glistened, not with victory but with something gentler, a peace I hadn't seen in him for months. Around us the benches emptied. People shuffled out, their voices hushed, their glances lingering on the frail man who had just defied the odds. Some shook their heads in quiet respect. Others whispered to one another, as though they had just witnessed something more than a legal battle, something human, something sacred. The air smelled faintly of old books and dust stirred by movement. But beneath it I caught the faintest trace of my father's aftershave, the same scent I'd known since childhood. It hit me suddenly, almost painfully, how much I feared losing even that small reminder. We walked slowly toward the door, the polished floor reflecting the dull light above. Each step echoed, but softer now, lighter. My father leaned on me more than before, his weight pressing into my side. I steadied him without hesitation, my arm firm around his back. The heavy oak doors swung open and daylight poured in. A pale winter sun, filtered through gray clouds but warm enough to sting my eyes. As we crossed the threshold, I felt it. The shift, the release, the fragile but undeniable sense of justice finally done. Outside, the air was crisp, tinged with the smell of damp pavement and exhaust from passing cars. Reporters lingered at the steps, cameras poised, microphones thrust forward. Questions flew sharp and insistent, but my father didn't answer them. He raised a hand, shook his head gently, and kept moving. Not out of pride, not out of secrecy, but because the victory wasn't theirs to dissect. It belonged to him, to us, to the years of sacrifice that no headline could capture. At the base of the steps he paused, his hand tightening on my arm. His breath came hard, but there was a faint light in his eyes, a glimmer that looked almost like triumph. He turned to me, his voice low, nearly swallowed by the wind. "Your mother would have been proud," he said. And in that moment my tears rose again, unbidden, because I knew he wasn't talking about the verdict. He was talking about us, about family, about the promise he had kept even at the cost of himself. The night after the verdict, the house felt different. It wasn't quieter, our house had always been quiet. It wasn't warmer, the heater still clicked on and off with its usual uneven rhythm. It was lighter, as if some invisible weight that had pressed on the walls, the floors, the very air we breathed had finally lifted. Yet my father seemed heavier. He sat in his chair by the window, a blanket over his knees. The lamp beside him cast a soft amber glow, turning the edges of his face into a sculpture of light and shadow. His eyes followed the snowfall outside, thick, slow flakes drifting under the yellow streetlight. I hovered in the doorway, unsure if he wanted company. But then he spoke, his voice thin, almost blending with the hush of the snow. "Come sit, son." I crossed the room, the carpet muffling my steps. The air smelled faintly of tea leaves steeping in the kitchen, mixed with the woody scent of the old furniture. For a while we just sat there. The silence between us wasn't strained this time. It was patient, full of things waiting to be said. Finally, he turned to me. His face looked older in that light, every line etched deeper, but his gaze was steady. "I need you to hear me," he said. "Not as a son listening to his father, but as a man listening to another man." My chest tightened. I nodded. He took a slow breath, his hand trembling slightly as he rested it on the armrest. "All my life I thought love meant shielding you, carrying the weight so you wouldn't have to. I thought that was strength. But now I see maybe I was wrong. Maybe strength is letting someone carry part of it with you." His words came haltingly, but with a clarity that pierced me deeper than any lecture ever could. "I should have told you sooner. I should have trusted you with the truth. But I need you to understand. My silence was never distance. It was devotion. A misguided one maybe, but devotion all the same." His eyes glistened, catching the lamplight. "You were the reason I fought every day. Not the house, not the job, not even my own pride. It was you. It was always you." The lump in my throat made it hard to breathe. I wanted to tell him he didn't need to explain, that I had already forgiven him. But I stayed quiet because I knew he needed to finish. He shifted slightly, pulling something from the pocket of his cardigan. A small envelope, folded and creased with age. He placed it in my hands. The paper felt fragile, soft from years of being carried. Inside was a letter, handwritten, the ink slightly faded. It was from my mother. I recognized her handwriting instantly. Curved letters, steady strokes. The date was from years ago, long before her passing. "She wrote this when you were little," my father said softly. "She asked me to give it to you when you were ready." I kept it, thinking I'd know the right time. But I don't think there is such a time, only now. My vision blurred as I traced the letters with my fingers. I didn't unfold it yet. I couldn't. He leaned back, his voice weaker now, but steady. "You'll read it when you need it. And when you do, remember, she and I, we both lived for the same thing. For you to grow, to love, to forgive." The snow outside thickened, blanketing the street in white. The only sound in the room was the faint tick of the clock above the mantel, each second carrying more weight than the last. My father reached for my hand, his grip faint but insistent. "Family," he whispered, "is not blood. It's not the house, not the name on a deed. It's the people who stand with you, who choose you, even when it costs them everything." His hand tightened once, then relaxed. His eyes closed briefly, as though the effort of words had drained him. But when they opened again, there was a softness I hadn't seen before, acceptance, even peace. "I don't have much time," he said, but I need you to promise me something. My throat ached. Anything. Promise me you won't waste your life carrying anger. Promise me you'll love louder than I did, that you'll let people in even when it scares you." I swallowed hard, the tears blurring the snow outside into streaks of white. "I promise," I whispered, and in that moment his smile came. Tired, faint, but real. The kind of smile that said he could finally lay his burdens down. The morning he was gone, the house was unbearably still. No sound of kettle hissing on the stove. No shuffle of boots against the mat. No cough carried through thin walls. Only silence, heavy, complete, like the house itself was mourning. I walked down the hallway, each step echoing too loudly, as if my own presence was intruding on something sacred. The air carried the faintest trace of him, aftershave, tea leaves, the must of old paper. Scents that clung to the walls, to the curtains, to my memory. He passed in his sleep, the doctor said gently, peaceful. But the word felt wrong in my ears. There was nothing peaceful about the hollowness gnawing at my chest, nothing calm about the sight of his empty chair by the window. Yet when I looked at his face one last time, I couldn't deny it. There had been peace there, a softening, as if he had finally laid down a burden carried too long. The days that followed blurred together. Condolences came in waves, neighbors at the door with casseroles, old friends with stories of him fixing a roof, lending a hand, standing firm when others faltered. Each story was another thread, weaving him larger than the man I alone had known. And yet every thread led back to the same truth. His life had been one long act of giving. It wasn't until the house grew quiet again that I began to see his legacy everywhere. In the garage, tucked behind boxes of tools, I found notebooks filled with neat rows of numbers, budgets, expenses, plans. Every dollar tracked, every sacrifice accounted for. Not out of obsession, but out of devotion, proof of how carefully he had guarded us. In the attic, I discovered a box of letters. Not just from my mother, but from him to her. Words he had never shown me. Simple lines, tender, unpolished. "We don't have much, but if the boy smiles today, that's enough." And then there was the envelope he had pressed into my hand before, the one with my mother's handwriting. It took me days before I was ready to open it. When I finally did, the paper crackled softly, fragile under my fingers. Her words flowed like a whisper from the past. "One day he may be gone, and I may be gone, but you will still carry us. Not in the weight on your shoulders, but in the love you choose to live with. Let that be our gift." The ink blurred as my tears fell onto the page. Between her words and his, I realized their voices would never truly leave me. The house became a museum of his presence. The worn handle of his mug on the kitchen shelf. The indentation of his recliner cushion, shaped by years of sitting late into the night. The faint scrape on the doorframe where his toolbox had bumped 100 times. Each detail was ordinary, yet together they formed a portrait. Not of a man defined by illness or death, but of a father whose very existence had been stitched into the life of his family. I began to notice something else too, in myself. The way I folded laundry, careful, precise, like he had. The way I checked the locks twice before bed, a small ritual of protection I'd never realized I inherited. Even the way I caught myself humming tunelessly while fixing the faucet. A sound I'd once teased him for, now spilling from my lips without thought. His presence lived in me, woven into habits, into reflexes, into the marrow of who I was. One evening, weeks later, I stood outside the house as the sun set. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine from the trees at the edge of the yard. I looked at the windows glowing warm against the darkening sky, and for the first time I didn't feel alone. I realized his true legacy wasn't the roof he fought to save, or the papers stacked neatly in courthouse files. It was the quiet courage he passed down. The lesson that love is measured not in words, but in the weight we're willing to carry for each other. And as I stood there, the cold air stinging my face, I whispered aloud to the night, to him, to her, to all that lingered unseen, "I will carry it. I will carry you." And in the silence that followed, for the first time since he was gone, I felt something settle inside me, not peace, not yet, but the beginning of it. The house stands quiet now. The court battles are over. The voices of my parents have settled into memory, into letters, into habits etched deep in my bones. I sit by the same window where my father once kept his vigil. The light falls the same way, slanting through the glass, catching dust motes as they drift in the air. But the man who once stood here with coffee in his hand is gone. And yet, somehow, he isn't. I hear him in the creak of the stairwell when I climb it too fast. I see him in the yard, in the way the grass grows unevenly where he once pushed a stubborn mower. I feel him in the ache of my own shoulders after long days of work, when I catch myself whispering the same tired phrases he used to say. Just one more hour, just one more step. The legacy of a father is not just in what he leaves behind. It is in the invisible threads that keep tugging at us long after he's gone. But as I sit here with his absence pressing into the air, I can't help but wonder, why did it take me so long to see him? Why did it take hospital corridors, courtrooms, and final words for me to finally understand what he had been giving all along? I ask myself that question every day, and maybe it's not just my question. Maybe it belongs to you too. So let me ask you, the one listening to my story now. When was the last time you looked at your father, not just as the man who raised you, but as a human being with his own battles, his own frailties, his own quiet sacrifices? When was the last time you told him you saw him, that you loved him, that his efforts had not gone unnoticed? We move through our lives so quickly, taking the meals, the warm houses, the repaired cars, the paid bills as things that simply are. We forget they were bought with someone else's exhaustion, with someone else's late nights and worn hands. I think about my anger, about the nights I shouted at him, about the word selfish that I threw like a stone, not knowing how heavy it would sit in my own chest afterward. And I think about how easily that anger could have been replaced with gratitude, if only I had spoken sooner, seen sooner, loved sooner. But time, as it always does, ran out. And so here I am, not telling you this story to break your heart, but to ask you the question I can never stop asking myself. What will you do with the time you still have? Will you wait, like I did, until it's too late, until the words you meant to say sit bitter on your tongue, unsaid, unspoken? Or will you look now, look at the people in your life who carry burdens silently, and tell them you see them? Because here's what I learned far too late: strength is not invincibility, love is not silence, and family is not about hiding pain to protect one another. It's about standing side by side even when the truth hurts. I imagine sometimes what it would have been like if I had said it earlier, if I had sat at that same kitchen table, looked my father in the eye and told him, "Dad, I see you. I see the nights you stayed up, the meals you skipped so I wouldn't have to, hours you traded so the lights would stay on. I see it and I thank you. I will never have that chance again, but you listening now, you still might. So I ask you this not as a storyteller, not as a voice in your ear, but as one human being to another. What is the phone call you need to make tonight? What is the apology you need to offer? What is the hug you've been holding back, the I love you you've been too embarrassed to say? Because life does not pause for us. It does not wait until we are ready. It moves relentlessly until suddenly all that's left is silence. If there's anything my father's life taught me, it's that love is heavy, and it is meant to be carried together. So carry it while you can. Carry it out loud, with open arms, with words spoken freely. Don't let it hide in the corners of your house, or wait until hospital corridors force you to see it. The snow outside has stopped now. The street is quiet, blanketed in white, as if the world itself has been given a fresh page. I sit by this window, his window, and though grief still lingers, I feel something else too, a small, steady flame. It is his gift, it is his legacy, and it is mine to carry forward. So let me leave you with this: go find your father, or your mother, or the person who has carried you quietly all these years. Look them in the eye, and say the words I waited too long to say. Tell them you see them. Tell them you love them. Tell them thank you, because one day, whether you want it or not, the chance will be gone, and all that will remain is the echo of what you wish you had said. Thank you for staying with me until the very end of this story. If it touched your heart, if it reminded you of your own family, let me know, share it, and help this message reach others who might need it. And don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next story. I wish you health. I wish your family peace. And I hope that love, whether quiet or loud, will always find its way back to your heart.